SEC has a golden opportunity to do something that makes a ton of sense, but according to multiple reports, they are about to botch it. There's been a ton of talk about an 8 or 9 game schedule for the SEC starting in 2024. The SEC powers that be have already determined that they will go to one of two models starting in 2024, an 8 game or a 9 game schedule with no divisions. All right, and I'm going to give you a little note of reference for the no divisions. Until last year, to participate in a conference championship game, for a conference to hold a conference championship game, there had to be either a round robin format or divisions to allow for that conference championship to exist. So this rule change is only allowed because of that rule change to conference games. All right, so now we get to the argument for 8 games. The SEC already has the toughest schedules in the conference, right? These teams beat up on each other week in and week out, and they play harder opponents than teams in the Big 10, in the Big 12, in the Pac-12, in the lowly ACC, all right? The SEC is king. The best college football is played in that conference. Do we really need to make the schedule even tougher? I don't know that there's a huge need to make things more difficult for teams to get to the championship game than it already is. By the time these schools make it to the playoffs, generally they've seen harder competition than they may even see in the playoffs later on, right? There is also extra revenue that will be generated for keeping a home game every single year. Currently, there are 8 SEC games, 4 home games, 4 out-of-conference games, and the SEC requires at least one of those out-of-conference games to be a Power 5. Now, the game that would go away if the SEC transitioned to a 9-game conference schedule would be your McNeese State, right? Your Northwest Children of the Blind school, your directional schools. So that guaranteed revenue of a home game every single year would be gone because that game would then be a home and away. Now, are you getting a better opponent? Yes, but these SEC schools would be losing a home game that is guaranteed on their schedule every single year. Another argument that we have heard from the SEC meetings this week is that the SEC is so hard physically on the players because the level of competition is so high that adding a 9th game could open schools up to even more injuries, could be harmful physically for players. I don't know that I really buy this excuse, which is what I think it is, because this wasn't something we heard a whole lot about from coaches when college football moved from 11 games to 12 games. It's not an argument we've heard a whole lot about from expanding the playoffs from 4 teams to 12 teams, even though when that happens, more physical football games will get added to those teams that do make the playoffs. So I do kind of think that's a little bit of an excuse. It does seem like most coaches that are willing to speak up, because most of them have been mum on this topic this week, are in favor of an 8-game schedule. I do think the powers that be in the SEC do really listen to what coaches think on topics before they vote. The coaches are not the people that actually vote, it's the athletic directors, but I do think athletic directors are heavily swayed by the influence of their coaches. That's also why I think it's kind of funny that a lot of SEC coaches haven't had a whole lot to say on the 8 versus 9 model this week, because this would be their opportunity to get it on record what they think should happen, and most of them are staying quiet. But listen, y'all, here is what is being missed. The argument should only be for 9 games, all right? We need 9 conference games in the SEC, not 8. 9-game format keeps more rivalries, especially now that Texas and Oklahoma are getting added to the SEC next year. 16 teams, y'all, in the SEC. If they stick with an 8-game schedule, you are going to have 1 common opponent and 7 rotating. So if you're Florida, you have to imagine that your 1 common opponent is going to be Georgia. A question I have about that is, does that mean that our 1 annual opponent will never be at home? Because Florida, Georgia in Jacksonville is an incredible tradition. Obviously, it's an incredible rivalry. But what does that do to those two schools if your one opponent that you have every single year doesn't even ever have the opportunity to play at home? A 9-game schedule would give you 3 common opponents. We've been told that there's a good chance that that would be Georgia, Oklahoma, and South Carolina. Now, obviously, personally, I would love Tennessee, Georgia, and LSU because those are Florida's rivals, in my opinion. But at the very least, when you have 3 that you see on a regular basis every single year, I think that that gives a little bit more room for parity among the permanents. Think about this. Tennessee, if there's only one permanent rival, do you know who they are more than likely going to end up with? Vanderbilt. So Tennessee gets Vanderbilt every single year, and Florida gets Georgia. There is 0 parity in that. And I understand the other 7 will rotate each year. So the positive of the 8-game schedule is that you will see every other team in the conference once every 2 years. And that's great. But the ability for schedules to be equal, to be similar, seems to kind of go out the window with the one permanent opponent. I think it's a lot easier for there to be some scheduling parity when there is 3 opponents. So let's say we get Georgia, one of the toughest teams in the SEC. We have to play them year in and year out. But that's balanced out by South Carolina, who is going to be an easier opponent than, let's say, an LSU or an Alabama. Imagine losing not 1, not 2, but 3 rivalries that we love. You lose all of them, right? Any game that you have a huge affinity for on that schedule, you circle it on the calendar every single year, that's your favorite rivalry, they're all going to be gone on an annual basis, except for likely Georgia. You'll see them every couple of years, but in my opinion, that's not the same as this rivalries that take place every single year. I can't imagine a September without Tennessee. I can't imagine an October without LSU. Those are going to be our realities if the SEC does in fact stick with this 8-game schedule, which it appears that they're going to. And guys, this isn't just a UF complaint either. Think about it from other teams' perspectives in the conference as well. If you are an Alabama fan, you look forward to that 3rd Saturday in September, right? When I say 3rd Saturday in September, we're not even Alabama fans over here, and you know that I am talking about their game with Tennessee. That's going to be gone. More than likely, Alabama's permanent opponent will be Auburn. But then if Auburn is Alabama's permanent opponent, that means Georgia loses Auburn. Can you imagine that there'll be a season without Georgia-Auburn? Think about Texas, newcomer to the SEC, probably really excited about the idea of getting to play A&M on a regular basis again. Texas-Arkansas is one of the original college football rivalries. That could be back in action. Oklahoma, but Texas is going to have one of those games. 1. So if Texas gets to keep one permanent opponent, let's say it's Oklahoma, we're not going to see some of these traditional rivalries every year that we were so excited about when we heard that Texas is coming back to the conference. I really think that this is going to damage some of the greatest rivalries in college football when we don't see them every single year. And another reason to go to a 9-game schedule is super simple, guys. More interesting football. Rivalries and SEC games fuel fan interest, okay? I would rather watch Florida play any team within the conference than a McNeese State, than a USF. I care most about our conference games. I think that pretty much every college football fan across the board feels the same way. Keeping fan interest is really important, right? That is how these conferences make money. That's how stadiums sell out. That's how merchandise sells. Rivalries and SEC games are what fuel that. That should be what is driving this pick to begin with. Fan interest fuels everything else. Another factor to take into consideration is that the Big 10, the Big 12, and the Pac-12 all already play a 9-conference game. And we all know the ACC is just waiting to see what their daddy does. And they'll head to a 9-conference game or 9-conference schedule if that's what the SEC chooses to do, right? So now that the playoffs are expanding, they're going from 4 teams to 12 teams. It is going to be imperative for strength of schedule to continue to be as strong as it has been in the SEC. I don't know that it's a great look that the conference expands to 16 teams, but keeps only 8 conference games, okay? When the SEC was a 10-team conference, there were 7 conference games played. When it expanded to 12 is when the SEC put in that 8th game. That's when the model changed to 8 conference games. We added 2 more teams, became a 14-team conference. We stayed at 8 conference games. Now that the SEC is expanding in 1 year to 16 teams, I do think that it's really important to add that 9th game for strength of schedule. The SEC is king in college football. They want to stay that way. They need to lead. That means that they've got to make some dynamic decisions, be willing to pivot, make some hard moves. And while I understand why a coach like Nick Saban may stay quiet this week, about going to a 9-game schedule, especially after having just lost to Tennessee and LSU in 2022 and that kind of damaging his chances at a playoff. He's probably saying, shoot, why would I want to play them every year if I have the opportunity to not play them every year? But you can't look at it from any one team's perspective. You've got to look at it as the conference as a whole. If every team within the conference, all 16 teams, plays 9 conference games, the strength of schedule there is going to be unmatched. When we move to 12 teams getting to the playoffs, the SEC will have the opportunity to get up to 7 teams in. There'll be six teams with guaranteed spots. One of those will be the SEC championship game. And then the next 6 bids are completely at large. If the SEC has as much talent, has as much, incredible teams in it as we all know it does, there's a good chance that they're going to get 4 or 5 SEC teams in on some years. Strength of schedule is going to be a factor in determining who gets picked, though. So making sure that the conference is sitting at the very top with their strength of schedule year in and year out is going to help get more playoff berths. I think it's important for fan interest. I think it's important for playoff interest. The move is 9 games, y'all. 8 games is taking the easy way out, in my opinion. I think they'll be back to the drawing board way sooner than later if they decide to, in fact, go with the 8-game model, which is what we're hearing they're doing. I think it will hurt rivalries. I think it'll hurt the conference overall, and I think they're going to be right back at it, correcting their own mistake in a couple short years. What do you guys think? Do you want to see more of UF's natural rivalries preserved? And are you a fan of the 8-game schedule with 7 rotating opponents? Let's talk about it in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And I appreciate you guys for watching. If you missed our last video on some recruits that UF is trending very well for, click right here.